Alright, everybody, without further ado, let's start the first narration from the book club. This is Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh by George R. Martin, read for you by Colin Barton. 4 of them waited in the drizzling rain of New Pittsburgh. 4 who walked and breathed, but only one lived. And only the living moved with purpose. His name was Sykes, a whip-thin young man with dark eyes set in an angular face, and he was impatient. The other didn't mind. The rain was nothing to them. They'd given up feeling long ago with their lives. But Sykes felt the rain. The leaking from the gray above in tiny droplets almost fine enough to be a mist. And he remembered it as he felt it. Remembered how it tasted of rust and acid, how it stung when it hit bare skin. Once he'd hated the rain, as he hated New Pittsburgh, but now there was only contempt. New Pittsburgh wasn't worth hatred. Move it, he snapped at last. He was hot, wet, tired of waiting. His papers weren't that interesting. The spaceport guard looked up in faint surprise from the window of the gate control booth, unused to being snapped at. He eyed Sykes and the 3 corpses curiously for a moment. Then he shrugged, folded up the papers, and handed them back. "Welcome to New Pittsburgh," he said without conviction. Sykes smiled, a quick, cold slash across his face. "Welcome back, you mean? But I'm not staying." "Yeah," said the guard, not really interested. "That's what they all say. Nobody's staying, but nobody leaves." He shrugged again. "Company office will be open tomorrow morning. They'll have work for you. Meantime, if you need a place to stay, I have a place to stay. I was born in here. You can skip the recital about dead man offenses, too. I know that shit." The guard shot him another curious look. "Born here?" "Yes, people do leave. The smart people." "You're not so smart," the guard said. "You came back." Sykes frowned, but did not reply. He was getting bored with the conversation. There were more important things to do. The guard threw the switch to kill the electricity on the 10-foot-high spaceport fence. Then he sung a sonic screech rifle over his shoulders, came outside, and unlocked the gate. Sykes strode through quickly. The 3 corpses shuffled behind him, their steps clumsy echoes of his own as he walked them through the corpse controller on his snug belt. Outside, he paused. He was back on New Pittsburgh. The town was dreary as ever. It was an afterthought, almost, sandwiched in awkwardly between the space field and the mountains, and it was ugly. 3 years hadn't changed that. The buildings were shoeboxes of corrugated duralloy that had never been meant to be permanent, but were. The streets and sidewalks were gray plastoid, pitted and worn by the constant drizzle of rust rain. They matched the monotony of the flat gray sky. It wasn't that color was illegal on New Pittsburgh, Sykes reflected, though sometimes it seemed so. When he was a kid, the only bright color he remembered seeing was the color of blood, and even that seemed grayish at times. He stood and looked down the dismal street and thought. His father had landed like this some 30-odd standard years ago, with a bigger corpse crew than Sykes had now, with hope, but not much brains and less knowledge, so the company grabbed him by the balls and never let go. The company was tough, but Sykes thought he was tougher. He was ready for New Pittsburgh. He was here for one night, no longer. He stirred and moved toward the building closest to the spaceport, a warehouse from the outside. But Sykes remembered what it really was, the company Dead Man Depot. The reception room was small and filthy, the grime-encrusted plastic counter untended, but there was a bell. Sykes hit it hard. Then he waited. The corpses waited too, just outside the door, unmoving. Eyes blank and empty, arms limp. You didn't need to see the metal plate in the back of a man's skull to know he was a dead man. A glance would do. They had no names, the corpses, not anymore. They had forfeited their names with their lives. Then they committed their crimes or had their accidents. Death had come on dingy corpse yard operating tables where their brains, crippled, criminal, troublemaking, were ripped out and destroyed. Then they rose again, with corpse pseudo-minds in their skulls, to command the still living bodies. The newborn dead, the cheapest labor of all. As men, they'd built up a debt to society. They paid it off with their lives and their bodies. You didn't waste anything in this universe, and the bodies of condemned criminals made valuable machines. Some corpse handlers gave their crews nicknames, but that sort of sentimental nonsense was not for Sykes. His father had been sentimental, and a loser. Sykes was a cold winner. Dead men were mindless hunks of flesh, property. He treated them as such. He owned 3, a large crew for a handler his age. The first he'd gotten by luck, a withered oldster picked up in a game of scio dice. The corpse had lost his right arm long before Sykes won him. He was nearly worthless. The second was something else, a 7-foot giant, a muscle man with broad shoulders and thick, corded arms. Sykes had saved for 2 years to buy him, but it was worth it. He was a prize, a first-class corpse, top meat. The third was a recent buy. Young, flaming red hair, a once handsome face, average quality, a little soft, but he'd toughen in time. And he had a long dead life ahead of him. Besides, he'd been a bargain. Sykes bought him on Vandalia, where harsh laws made corpses common and dirt cheap. There was a noise. Behind the counter, a door popped open, and a stubby little man stepped through. He wore a white smock of a corpse technician, not blood-stained, and he was peeling off a pair of gloves as he walked. Sykes didn't know him. He felt vaguely let down. When he left, the technician had been Banner, fat Banner with a beard and a big laugh, who'd predicted more than once that Sykes would wind up on this table. But he'd also given Sykes a controller to play with, and shown him how to handle a dead man, something his father would never do. "I rang for the depot man," Sykes said. "I've got 3 corpses to slop." The man slapped his gloves down on the counter. "I am the depot man. Tech 2. We do double duty around here. The company likes hard workers." He eyed the corpses. "A company $1 a night for each, and we take no responsibility for damage." He took out a form and a pencil and pushed them across the counter. "And you'll want to convert your money. I'll do it for you. On New Pittsburg, we use company dollars. Rates 3 stellars for $2. Sykes didn't like the man. He stifled the urge to ask what happened to Banner and the old depot clerk. "That's pretty high," he said, toying. "What if I don't want to convert?" "Got to," the man snapped. "Company rules." Sykes smiled his cold smile. He knew all about company rules. The New Pittsburg Company had opened the planet, and still owned it. It had political as well as economic clout, and its rules were the force of law. Earth, with its guidelines and settlement company regulations, was long light years away. Sykes knew about conversion rates, too. His father had arrived here with a pocket full of Vandalian stellars. The pocket had been a lot roomier after conversion. But Sykes was smarter than his father. He was ready. "That's all right," he said, pulling a fat roll of bills from his pocket. "I converted already, on Vandalia, at the real rate." He smiled again, enjoying it, and pushed 3 bills at the small man. The company man looked up sharply, but he took the bills, and then opened a gate in the counter. "This way," he said. Sykes followed him behind the counter, and through a door. The corpses came after, walking with a slow, clumsy gilt. It was Sykes who walked them, really. A corpse handler sent impulses to the controller at his belt in the same half-thinking way he sent impulses to his own muscles. The psi circuits in the controller picked up the commands and relayed them to the corpse pseudo-mind, then amplified the impulses, went out to the nerves and tendons and muscles of the body, and the dead man walked. They could do other things, too. Swing a pick, lift a crate, carry a load, run a machine. Lots of things, depending on the skill of the handler. Walking a corkscrew was easy, but having 3 or 4 dead men at work on 3 or 4 different tasks was a feat of different order, like running 4 bodies at once. Behind the reception room was a long corridor, then another door, then the warehouse, huge and dark and rank with the smell of corpse flesh. Light poured in through an open door, and Sykes could see corpses sprawled everywhere. They covered the floor in piles, flopping all over each other, until the piles stretched away into the darkness. A few were lying in the slop troughs that lined the walls. If the stink was any indication, there were thousands of dead men littering the warehouse floor. "Flop 'em down anywhere," the small man told Sykes. "Pick 'em up in the morning, though, or you pay extra." Sykes glanced at him coldly. The depot was worse than he remembered. Much worse. He was annoyed, but kept his voice even. "Where do you get off charging $1 for this? What do you want? Beds? Makes no difference to them. Most places have boards, wood bunks, shelves, something. You used to." Again, the small man eyed him sharply. "Yeah, well, it got crowded, and this isn't most places. They can't feel a thing anyway. Flop 'em, I said." "Right by the door?" Sykes said. He laughed lightly. "So they get stepped on by thousands of corpses coming out? I get here late and they're ruined." He shook his head. "We are not responsible for damage. Flop 'em anywhere you like." The small man turned and left. Sykes touched his controller and snapped a silent mental command. His 3 dead men stumbled forward, almost in step, trotting on limp, uncomplaining bodies as they walked across the huge room. When they were deep enough into the darkness so that they had a reasonable chance to avoid being trampled, Sykes disengaged his mind, and the corpses did an ungainly flop. They would not move again until he moved them. The pseudo-minds kept their hearts beating and their lungs at work, but Sykes was their will. They turned to his controller, and his alone. He thumbed the belt box off and returned to the reception room. The small man was putting on his gloves. Behind him, the second door was open. Sykes got a glance of a body, face down on a white table, with a shining new metal plate in its skull. Memories came back in a rush of the other bodies he'd seen in that room, of the time Banner had let him watch a conversion. Hardly 10, he'd cowered in the room, wearing a surgical mask and an oversized smock. 2 company policemen, stern in blue and black, carried the man in from their wagon. He'd already been drugged. He was heavy, hard-faced, with hair like dark fine wine, and he'd killed a company officer. Sykes knew him vaguely. His name had been Karpov, and he'd worked as a hired handler. The police had dropped him on the table, and Banner went to work quickly, shaving his skull, attaching a tangled tube of instruments, setting up a stasis field to keep life in the body. Then, from behind, he'd cut through the skull, down into the brain, slicing at it, removing it deftly, piece by piece. The machines kept the body going. Banner, his gloved hands very sure, took a pseudo-mind from its case, set to work hooking it up with the spinal column and the nerve endings. Sykes had been too far away to see exactly what he'd done. Afterwards, when the steel plate had locked the pseudo-mind into place, and the body was breathing normally again without the support of machines, Sykes had come close and touched it. The skin had been warm, and he felt a pulse. "He's not dead," he said, suddenly not understanding. Banner, his mask off, only laughed his big laugh. "Body isn't, but Karpov is." Then he'd picked up a controller, tuned it to the new pseudo-mind, and Karpov's corpse had risen and chased Sykes out the door. It all came back then, as Sykes stared at the body through the open door, and wondered if this small man had ever used his corpse to frighten kids. Then he put the thought away. "Don't tell me you left a customer waiting while you took care of me," he said. The small man flexed his fingers, looked up, and frowned. "He's all done. Got the pseudo in. Now all I gotta do is tune it to a controller." "What'd you get him for?" Sykes asked, hoping it wasn't anyone he'd known. There were a lot of old friends who'd been headed for the table when he left. "Assault on a company officer," the small man said. Sykes tried not to show surprise. 3 years ago, simple assault hadn't been a dead man offense. New Pittsburg was getting tougher. Each world had its own list of dead man offenses, crimes that would make a man a corpse. The list was longest on the raw, new colonies where machines were expensive and labor scarce, and it looked like conditions were worsening on New Pittsburg. The depot man vanished behind the operating room door. Sykes stepped outside. Night had come, but it was still raining a rusty drizzle, and it was still hot. Lights burned in the windows of several windows. Sorry, what the fuck? This thing just glitched out for a second. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. This website can be a little annoying sometimes. Lights burned in the windows of several of the grim metal buildings that lined the street. Most of the lights didn't interest them. He knew the one he wanted. It was a tavern restaurant, well lit and noisy but nearly empty. The long mockwood bar was occupied by only 2 customers, and the scattered tables were deserted. Customers and barkeep both looked up when Sykes entered and eyed him with open curiosity. The short silence was broken by one of the patrons, a man Sykes had never seen before. "You're new," he said. "Not really," said Sykes. He looked at the barkeep, a tall man with a craggy face and wide shoulders, slightly stooped by age. "Looks like the business is off, Rob." The bartender had been staring at him. Now he started. "Sykes," he said. "My God, Glenn Sykes!" He gasped, then broke into a smile, and offered a huge rough hand. Sykes took it, clasped, and smiled back. Not his usual cold slash this time. Something warmer, gentler, less certain, and almost involuntary. A slow curl at the corners of his mouth. "A long time," he said. 3 full years. Kenyon, the barkeep, nodded numbly. Then one of the customers was on her feet, offering her own hand. "Remember me?" she asked when Sykes turned her way. Sykes studied her. She was gaunt, middle-aged, with baggy clothes and a hook nose. "Sure," he said. "Sal something or other, corpse handler. You were just new when I left." "Right," the woman said. She gestured toward her drinking companion, the man who'd accused Sykes of being new. "That's Eddie. He's been here 2 years or so." Sykes gave him a nod, then turned quickly back to Kenyon. "Where is everybody else? Mueller and Kathy, and the slob, and Dave Anderson, and Roy, and Banner, damn it. I went by the depot, and some new guy was in charge." "Banner's dead," Kenyon said. "Keeled over about a year ago. Right at work, too. Hell, on his own table. Everybody said they should have made a dead man out of him. The slob's dead, too. Her whole crew got wiped out in a mine flood. We've had a lot of wipeouts in the last couple years, Glenn. Things been getting worse since you left." Sykes pulled up a bar stool and sat down. "I noticed. Electric fence around the space field, and no shelves on the depot, and a corpse tech doubling as a depot man. Banner never would have done that." "Banner did do that," Kenyon said. Company changed things about a year and a half ago, before he died. He had no choice. He was company. But they pushed him around too. You know how it was. Profits have been going down. Things are more marginal than ever. Company's really in a panic. Sykes nodded again. Figures. It's hard to see this place getting even worse. It was bad enough when I was here, but it figures. What else has been going on? Mueller's still around, Kenyon told him. He's in the mills now, working a Company 8 crew. Always was a good handler. Kathy wound up marrying Roy Anderson. Roy? I thought it was Dave she was hot for. Kenyon shrugged. Guess she cooled. Haven't seen her or Roy for a while, to tell the truth, but Dave still comes around. Mueller too. They'll probably be around in later. I can wait, Sykes said. Meantime, I'll have a beer. Kenyon drew a glass slowly and set it down. What about you, Glenn? What have you been doing? I never expected to see you back here in New Pittsburg. The beer was strong and dark, but it had a bitter aftertaste that Sykes didn't recall from the old taste. Still, it was beer. He quaffed it down and ordered another. I never expected to come back, he told Kenyon, when the barkeep set down the second glass. Not sure why I did. I'm just passing through, really. Spent the last year on Vandalia, but I didn't like it much. It's a bad place. They need corpses fierce for this big wilderness campaign. So they've got dead man laws, rough ones. One wrong step and you're on the table. I've heard, Kenyon said. It's getting worse here, too. So I learned. The company tech tells me assault's a dead man offense now. Shit. Kenyon shook his head. Not just assault, Glenn. Assault on a company officer. They had a couple mine bosses beat up pretty good after a few of those floods. Of course, Sykes said. Makes sense. Had something like that on Scracky, too. I was there before Vandalia. The whole damn planet is covered by factories, strip mines, mills, and everything is sulfur. The atmosphere wasn't so good anyway, so they figured there'd be no harm in polluting it, I guess. But now they can't get people to work there, just corpse crews. He finished his second beer and shoved the empty across the bar. Kenyon took it and refilled it. Is that what you do, Glenn? Work a corpse crew? Sykes nodded. Yes, he said a little belligerently. Never knew that, did you, Rob? Banner taught me everything he knew. I've got my own crew now, 3 of them. And I've got money saved. I'm going places, Kenyon, just like I said I would. Eddie, the stranger, laughed suddenly. Going places? And you come back here? You're either crazy or stupid. I'm here for 1 night, Sykes said. 1 night only. I leave tomorrow. I know all about New Pittsburg. My father came to work here for a few months. He never left. But I left, and I'll leave again. This place isn't getting its claws into me. Eddie smirked and went back to his drink. Sal nodded. Keep thinking that way. Get out while you can. You don't have to warn me. I was born here, remember? Yeah, said Sal, but it's worse now. When I got here, I was staying just long enough to earn passage money. Figured it'd be easy. I had a 5 crew. A 5 crew, damn it. Sykes smiled. The cold version. He remembered Sal better now. The woman had been a new arrival when he left. A cool, swaggering, independent handler who was going to teach the natives how to deal with the company. I'll bet you had trouble finding work, Sykes said. Sal's face twisted with unreadable emotion. Oh, I got work all right, but not until I was nearly flat. The company waited until I was desperate. Then they offered me mine work, and you jumped at it, Sykes said. Damn right, she said. She laughed, a thin, cracky sound that grated on the ears. Pay wasn't bad. Regular corpse handle fees, plus day labor for 5 dead men. Sykes didn't know the details, but he could guess the rest of the script. It was a very old story, and fools like Sal were always around to star in it. His father had played the lead once, in an earlier version. Nobody ever told me expenses would be so damn high, Sal continued bitterly. Rent, depot fees, imported food, because nothing grows on this muckhole. Even though I was working, the money seemed to go as fast as I got it, and the work was rough on the corpses. It always is, Sykes said. He'd learned that a long time ago. But big mouths like Mueller and the Slob never quite understood what was being done to them. The company gives the dirty jobs and the risk to the independent crews. The safe jobs go to company corpses under hired handlers. One of my corpses had a hand chewed off by an automole the first week. The first week! Year later, I lost 2 of my crew in a mine flood. Tough. Sal was encouraged. Lifted her drink, continued. I still had 3 corpses. A little money, but the mine work was getting to me. I tried for a transfer. The company offered me a deal. They'd move me to the mills if I sold them a corpse. So I did. Sykes was getting bored by the hard luck story. That was stupid, he said. Not unusual, mind you, but stupid. Sal squinted at him, half puzzled. She'd expected sympathy. It was a new Pittsburg tradition for the handlers to sit around in bars and cry over what the company had done to them, but Sykes refused to play. You don't know what it's like down there, Sykes, Sal said, a little uncertainly. The rain seeps down into the ground and you're knee-deep in water most of the time, and it's hot, suffocating. The machinery is junk, old, unreliable, no safety precautions. I've seen more than one automobile go berserk and chew up its crew instead of rock. Kenyon had been listening to the whole exchange. It's the same junk your father worked with, Glenn, only older. The barkeep said while refilling his glass, the company's been cutting corners, running things even cheaper than before. Ramshackle machinery, corpse labor, dirt wages, all part of it. Sykes sipped the beer carefully and put it down with a smug smile. Sure, he said, but none of that's new. You just have to know how to deal with it. He turned to Sal. You don't have to go on. Just tell me how many corpses you've got left. None, she said reluctantly. I'm a hired handler. And you had a 5 crew, Sykes said. His voice was a whip. So what did you do? Sell them one by one? Let the money slip away? If you had any brains, you'd have sold them all at once. Gotten enough money for a ticket off world. A handler don't sell her crew, Sal said stubbornly. Not if it can be helped. Here, it can't be helped. How long does an independent last on New Pittsburg? You stay here. The only question is whether you do it smart or stupid. You did it stupid. Sal's face, already blurred by drink, got ugly. You talk smart, but your father didn't do much better from all I hear. No, Sykes admitted. He was getting a bit drunk himself. I did, though. I got out. I left New Pittsburg. That shut Sal up. Kenyon, sensing the strain, took over and led this talk to safer channels. Where are you going now, Glenn? Out along the arm, Sykes said. They just opened up a new world out there, a place called Slag. The settlement company is looking for handlers. I hear it's awful hot, but the money is good. I figure I'll try that for a while, then move on. To Mountain Home, maybe. I've heard a lot about it, a resort planet. They say it's really nice. Maybe I'll settle there. Rob Kenyon was polishing a glass, looking thoughtful. As a handler? He said. Sykes' grin had no humor. He knew what Kenyon meant. Dead men were barred from Mountain Home. As handlers, though admitted, were treated icily. It was the same on most civilized worlds. The good citizens called corpse handlers meat minds, though not to their face, and saw the whole profession as unclean. Old Earth was like that too, and New Home, and Silver Sky, and Zephyr. All the older, richer colonies, in fact. All those mature worlds. Any sort of capital punishment was unheard of, and the particular brand used to fashion dead men was considered particularly grisly. In a way, it was ironic. The process had originally been discovered on old Earth itself, almost by accident. A man, his brain smashed out by a bullet, had reached a medical center while his body was still alive. He was dead, hopelessly, but the doctors decided to try to keep the still healthy body alive for possible use in a brain transplant. The first experimental pseudomind was installed, and it worked. The body lived. Only then, before any call came for a brain transplant, One experimenter tried fitting a psionic circuit to the pseudomind. He got a human robot. He called it a dead man. Later, corpse. More corpses were made. Better ones after that. The uses were obvious, but so were the reactions. The experimenters suddenly became pariahs. One medical center after another stopped research. And less than 5 years after the process had been discovered, Old Earth banned it. New Home, its oldest daughter, followed suit, and the others one by one. But not all the others. The newer worlds, far out ones, the untamed ones, the unpleasant ones, needed hands badly. Corpse crews were welcomed. The process was continued in the hands of medical professionals who came to be corpse techs. They created dead men and tended them, but the pseudomind research stopped. The colonial techs lacked the sophistication for that. The oldest corpse was less than a century old, but already institutions had arisen. Dead man depots, corpse yards, meat houses, dead man offenses. The corpse crews took over the work that was too disagreeable for men and too hard for all but the most expensive machines. They became the cheapest, crudest labor of all. Crude. That was the word for corpse labor, and to many for corpse handlers. That was why Sykes would not be welcomed on Mountain Home. That was why they'd whisper, meat mind, and ghoul behind his back, but he still intended to go. I'm not always going to be a handler, he told Kenyon sharply. Just for a while, until I get enough money together. Then I'll go to Mountain Home and take up something else. He smiled. Maybe I'll be a bartender. Kenyon was looking at him. Your father didn't want you to be a handler after all. That's why he wouldn't teach you. Sykes shrugged. He should have tried teaching me something else then. Instead, he sold all his corpses, scrimped away his life as a hired handler, and died. That did me a lot of good. Left me here on New Pittsburg with nothing. Money, Kenyon said. He left you some money. Not nearly enough for passage off planet. I got that myself, my own ways. You're right, Glenn. I can't argue with you. But your father meant well. He didn't want you to wind up on New Pittsburg, not one bit, not one moment. He just didn't know how to get you off is all. He smiled. That you did by yourself. You're sort of famous, you know. The guy that got away. I guess the rest of us could do it too, if we really tried. But we've built up ties, and they're hard to cut. You're different, I guess. You were always a loner. Sykes acknowledged that with a nod. I said I'd get away, and I did. He looked very pleased. Kenyon sighed, looked at him strangely, and reached for his glass to fill it once again. Just then there was a sound at the door. A group of men shuffled out in the rain, led by a huge grizzly of a man in a handler's coverall. He took one look at Sykes and roared, Glenn, you goddamn little asshole, you! What in the hell are you doing back here? Sykes looked at him and smiled his second smile, the real one. I'm Mueller, he said, laughing. You haven't changed a bit. They drank until closing. Him and Mueller and the Andersons, who came in later, and others, friends and enemies, and people that Sykes had long ago forgotten. They went to Kenyon's apartment behind the tavern and drank some more. And Big Mouth Mueller laughed uproariously and told stories about the old days and dirty jokes about his corpses, and asked Sykes what the tale was like on Vandalia and Scracky. Then finally Mueller passed out, and then the others left, and Sykes got some sleep. But he was up before dawn. He woke Kenyon and spoke to him briefly, borrowing a worn rain cape and asking directions. He said goodbye too. That was his last night on New Pittsburg. The graveyard was way beyond the town, sprawling out over 2 hills and the valley in between. Sykes walked there in the rain, thinking. The tombstones had been stones in the old days. Now they cast them in the same gray plastoid used for sidewalks. The constant rust rain had eaten away at them, and already the letters were dissolving. In another 3 years, they'd be gone. But Sykes found the right marker, and a pitted slab graven with the name Donald Sykes. He cursed the plastoid tombstone, and the company, and New Pittsburg, and he stood there in silence with his cape, while the rain fell around him and bit at his bare skin, and he wondered briefly how they told this man grave from the ones they dug for corpses. Then he realized they didn't. He stayed for a long time. It was, after all, his first visit. Finally, he turned and headed back towards the town and the depot. He had corpses to pick up, a ship to catch, a world waiting. They buried his father here, but not him. Not him. He was the one that got away. Sykes the corpse handler thought on that, and smiled on the long walk back to his dead men. Alright. If you have any thoughts that you want to share right now, you can leave them in the comments. If you want to criticize my poor ability to narrate, I'd appreciate it if you didn't, because I'm only doing this to try to draw more people into the book club. But yeah, the 14th, next Wednesday after this upcoming one this week, that's going to be when the live stream is. It's going to be here on YouTube, I think. I've never done a YouTube live stream before, but we're going to figure that out, ahead of time. And I will disseminate the link in advance so everyone is ready, and we can all congregate here on YouTube and talk about it and kind of get some ideas going. So if you have ideas for what story we should do next, go ahead and leave them down below. I do think we're going to be doing something from Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, because I kind of want to do a change of pace. Rather than doing the entire Corpse Sailor trilogy all in one back-to-back-to-back go, I want to break it up with things that will draw other people in or just give us, some difference. So don't forget to leave a like and subscribe and comment and follow me on Patreon.